We'll get started in just 1 minute here, folks. We're just waiting for more people to join up. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, today we are looking at the revolutions of 1848. And 1848 is a very important year in the 19th century in European history because Europe was swept by a wave of liberal revolutions, and it really ended it really ended the conservative order that had been established by the Congress of Vienna. But you know, what's interesting about this is that these revolutions that happened in 1848, as I've mentioned to you before, largely fail. And so even though this ends the conservative order established by the Congress of Vienna and guys like Clemens von Metternich, it's not going to be the end of conservatism altogether. All right, there will be still several conservative politicians who end up rising to political prominence in the latter half of the 19th century as we enter into the age of real politic. Revolutions of 1848. It even sweeps Austria, which forced Metternich to resign and go into exile in England of all places, which is really kind of funny and ironic because, of course, of all of the great powers of Europe that attended the Congress of Vienna back in 1815, 30 years earlier, England was the one that Metternich predicted would be the first to have a revolution. But unusually, England has no revolutions. They came close. They came awfully close with the Chartist movement, which we'll talk about today. But England didn't have a revolution. And what's interesting about that is that England's government was the most liberal of all. Remember that I told you that on an international level, ostensibly, Britain supported conservatism and a return to order after Napoleon was defeated. But at home, domestically, Britain had very liberal economic policies that allowed for them to industrialize at a rapid pace. And so England goes into exile in England during the Austrian revolutions that are going on in his home country. And leading up to the 1848 revolutions, this major wave of revolutions affected all of Europe except Great Britain, which of course was at the time the most advanced European nation, and Russia, which was the least advanced European nation. Now we have to understand that politically the revolutions of 1848 really failed to achieve the kind of reforms that the revolutionaries were seeking out. These revolutionaries were liberal revolutionaries, but remember that their goals were rather overly idealistic, and as a result of that kind of overly idealistic, romanticized vision of the revolutions, they just weren't super practical in how they were carried out. But nonetheless, these revolutions signified an overwhelming discontent with autocratic rule from absolute monarchs that, even though weren't completely resolved in these revolutions, would eventually confront all of Europe. In 1848, it's the first time that we see on a broad scale across most of the European continent a rejection of the old way of doing things. And even though the old way of doing things isn't going to be completely removed, we are only about 65 years, 67 years away from World War I. And so in 1848, if you fast forward 67 years, that brings you up to 1914, 1915. And in 1914, World War I happens, and after World War I ends in 1918, we see the end of permanently the end of these old dynasties that had been in power in Europe across various different places for centuries. The Romanov dynasty comes to an end at the end of World War I. The Ottoman Empire comes to an end at the end of World War I. The German Empire comes to an end at the end of World War I. The Austro-Hungarian Empire comes to an end. All of them are going to be facing their inevitable doom here after the 1848 revolutions. It's just going to take a little while for that to happen. These 1848 revolutions were largely led by the middle and bourgeois classes, bourgeoisie, upper middle class, wealthy business peoples and things like that. And the revolutions failed largely because of disagreements between the working class and middle classes following their initial successes in deposing these autocratic rulers. And so given that they had a a lack of a unified vision. Autocratic rulers were, in most cases, able to reinstate their power shortly after the revolutions fail. And of course, as I mentioned to you last class when we were talking about socialism, mostly utopian socialism, but I also did mention to you about the extreme version of socialism known as communism. Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx was written in the same year that these 1848 revolutions were happening. So 1848 is kind of a big year, and leading up to 1848 revolutions, only Britain and Russia managed to avoid significant upheavals, and the reasons are almost exactly the opposite of one another. In Britain, the reason that they're able to prevent any sort of serious revolt is because Britain by 1832 and then again in the 1840s and even beyond that, the British are in Parliament are passing liberal reforms that prevented people from being angry enough to begin a revolution. On the other hand, just the opposite in Russia, conservative oppression, conservative oppression, autocratic rule prevented liberal revolutions from taking hold in Russia. You know, Russia as a nation in Europe, because it's so far east and the size of Russia is so huge, Russia takes a very long time to transition to a modern industrial economy. Nowadays, of course, they have been for some time, but the Russians go through their industrial revolution about a century after Britain does. So, you know, even though it's 1848, the leaders of Russia are still running Russia as though it's 1748. All right, they are just really far behind in terms of kind of the direction that, say, Britain or France or Germany is going by this point. And so these two places, Britain and Russia, avoid significant upheaval, but for the exact opposite reasons. Britain is making liberal reforms that smooths over the grievances of the people so that they're less angry and less likely to have a revolution. On the other hand, conservative oppression, brutal autocratic control from the Tsar is what prevents the liberal revolutions from taking hold in Russia. So let's talk a little bit about Britain. I mentioned to you last class the Battle of Peterloo, sometimes called the Peterloo Massacres. This resulted in 15 people being killed and several hundred more being injured as horses charged into the crowd. And much of these the Battle of Peterloo, these riots that took place in Britain, had to do with a rejection of the Corn Laws. Remember, the Corn Laws weren't about corn on the cob. They were about British grain, wheat, oat, barley, those kinds of things. But there was a tariff that had been put on all foreign grain in Britain, forcing people to pay for the more expensive British grain. And people didn't like that, in particular because grain is a survival necessity, right? People needed grain in order to be able to make bread, which in most places in Europe is the staple of the European diet. Parliament at this time is very much a gentleman's club. It is it's made up of wealthy, either aristocratic or bourgeois middle class business owners who are pretty well to do, and there were various property requirements that were in place that necessitated that people own a certain amount of property to even be able to vote on the members of Parliament, much less serve in Parliament yourself. But it's going to be dominated by landowners, people who are already pretty wealthy. and you have these what are known as rotten boroughs that develop. Think of boroughs as voting districts, okay? Let me explain this idea of rotten boroughs to you. Take, for example, the United States, okay? Let's just take it to the U.S., and I'm going to give you an example here and follow my line of thinking. So, over the course of the history of the United States, the population has migrated. Population density has shifted in various locations. Back in 1820, almost nobody lived in California. Okay, California had very, very few people. It wasn't even a state yet. Okay, California doesn't become a state until what, like 1848, 1849, somewhere in there. All right. So there were very few people. When California first became a state, it had still very, very few people compared to how many people live in California today. All right? Why is this significant? Think about it in terms of voting. When we do our presidential elections, as we just did last year in 2020, the state's electoral count is what determines who becomes president, right? It's not the popular vote. And California, being the most populous state in the United States, we have literally more people living in the state of California than the entire country of Canada, okay? That gives you an idea of just how huge the population of California is. Imagine, though, for a minute, if we didn't have the Electoral College, or if we had the Electoral College and it was still being counted the same way that it was back in 1850, meaning that despite 170 years of population growth in California, imagine we still had only, 5 electoral votes that contributed to the presidential election. People in California would be really upset about that, right? Because what that would mean is that the state would be severely underrepresented based on the population that lived there, all right? And other places that had lesser populations would be overrepresented because in the last 170 years, places that used to be more populous are now less populous, okay? Speaking in terms of percentages, that is, of the population. Aggregate numbers, the United States has far more people today than it ever did in history. But my point being that the concentration of the population has shifted. And that's exactly what's going on in Britain during the Industrial Revolution due to urbanization. As the industrialization takes place, people are moving from rural areas to urban areas, cities. And in Britain at this time, there was not an automatic provision in place the way that we have in the United States, where we determine the number of electoral votes based on essentially on the population and the number of people that we have in the House of Representatives, right? So over time, as the population has grown in California, the representation in the House of Representatives has gone along to match that, all right? But in Britain, they didn't have any provision like that. And so what was happening was that as these populations were moving from rural areas to urban areas, the rural areas, which had become depopulated, were now being represented as though they still had lots and lots of people living in them. Meanwhile, the urban districts, which had seen profound population growth, were severely underrepresented in Parliament because they were still being counted as though they were tiny. All right, so these are known as rotten boroughs. And one of the things that the Reform Bill of 1832 is going to do is to fix the rotten boroughs, or at least some of them, not all of them at first, but they're going to begin to fix some of the rotten boroughs so that the parliamentary representation is more accurately reflective of the proportion of the population in various places in England. Now, at this time, prior to the Reform Bill of 1832, only about 8% of the population is enfranchised. What that means is has voting rights. Enfranchised is another way of describing voting rights. Also, suffrage is another synonym there. But the Reform Bill of 1832 brings up the franchise by about 50%. Now, that's a good number, but still, we only have about 12% of the population having the ability to participate in parliamentary elections. Meanwhile, like I said, they started doing this redistribution of seats to try to get rid of those rotten boroughs and make the parliamentarian the parliament more representative of the population. All right. The biggest and most significant political movement by the working class of the 19th century in Britain is without a doubt the Chartist movement, sometimes referred to as the People's Charter in 1838. And there were 6 goals of the Chartist movement. They were universal male suffrage, equal-sized electoral districts, voting by secret ballots, no property qualifications for Parliament, pay for members of Parliament, and annual elections of Parliament. Now, to talk a little bit about the Chartist movement, the first thing that I'll tell you is that the Chartist movement is largely a failure, okay, in the short term. The People's Charter does not convince Parliament at the time to make these changes. However, over time, as time goes on, more and more of these 6 points will be adopted. The only one of these 6 points that never gets adopted is the last one, annual elections. So let's talk a little bit about the Chartist movement here. Now, I should probably mention this to you. I understand that the Chartist movement is something that you read about in answered reading guide questions on during the Industrial Revolution unit, and I didn't lecture on it at that time. The reason I'm lecturing on it in this unit is because I consider it more a part of the reforms than of the Industrial Revolution. Of course, they're inextricably linked with one another. It's just that the publishers of your textbook decided to put the Chartist movement in with the Industrial Revolution rather than with the talking about the reforms that happened in Britain as well as the revolutions of 1848. And so I just feel like the Chartist movement fits better with this unit. And that's why I saved lecturing on it until now. But I didn't want you to just skip over that part of the textbook last unit. So I just kind of didn't make a whole lot of mention about it. But now we're talking about it. And so the universal male suffrage thing. Of course, these days, not only do we have universal male suffrage, we just have universal suffrage. It's for men and women. But in the early days, women did not have the right to vote. Women were not able to either serve in government or vote for people in government. They don't get the right to vote in England until after World War I. So we are definitely seeing, sexism in history here, right? Because we're still living in a largely patriarchal, male-dominant society in Europe, and that goes for Britain as well as America. And so the universal male suffrage thing will happen in not too long a time after the Chartist movement. Equal sized electoral districts, there's going to be more reform bills in England that are going to make the rotten boroughs more equal to in proportion to their population and representation in terms of number of seats in Parliament. Voting by secret ballot. That's something that we hold sacred here in the United States, the secret ballot, right? When we go and vote, our vote is confidential. It's not public information. Our neighbors can't look up who we voted for or those kinds of things. If you want to talk about it with people, that's your own personal agenda. You're more than welcome to talk politics and tell people who you voted for. But here in the United States, we still, it's still one of those things where even amongst my closest friends, I typically don't ask them who they voted for because it's not my business. And, the secret ballot is good because we want people to vote for the people that they want to vote for in privacy. We don't want people to be publicly influenced and be forced or coerced into a vote. No property qualifications. Even here in the United States, we had property qualifications in voting for a long time. If you wanted to participate in government, you needed to demonstrate that you had a reason to participate in government. People who didn't own land were viewed as kind of, unworthy of the vote because most of the laws that were, here's the opinion. Here's the idea behind it. If you didn't own property, that meant that you were probably a poor farmer, okay? And if you're a poor farmer, you probably don't have a great education. You probably have some kind of, you may have some wacky ideas about politics or not really fully understand the system or whatever. Here in the United States, I think that hopefully we are getting better at this, although I don't know if the verdict is in on that yet. But it is, to me, extremely concerning the number of people in the United States who have a pretty limited knowledge about even the most basic functions of our government. And when people show up to the polls and vote, you want them to be making rational, reasonable decisions in the voting booth that are in their best interest. Unfortunately, what happens a lot of times is people have a tendency to show up, not really have the foundational knowledge necessary to make an informed decision at the polls. To give you an example of that, here in California, we have the propositions that come up on the ballots. Not every state has that. California does, though. Those propositions are worded really confusingly. Even for me, I have a graduate degree in history, and I find myself having to really sit and read those propositions extremely carefully multiple times. And as much as I'd love to believe that every citizen in the state of California cares as much about it as I do and takes the time to sit down and really study what it is that they're going to be going in and voting for, I can assure you that that is not the case. So what happens is people read a proposition about whatever it is, saving the puppies or what. They don't realize that it's going to cost the state X billion of dollars, and then they go in and they vote for something based on a knee-jerk reaction without really reading the fine print. And lo and behold, the state becomes overburdened with debts and programs that we can't afford to pay for and all of these other things. And it can really cause chaos. It can cause problems. And so in this olden day time in the 1800s here in America, one of the reasons that property qualifications were in place is because the government was very much run by elitists for elitists. Now that starts to change a bit in the 1830s under Jackson's presidency, but still, you know, there's a lot that we can say about Jackson, who was in many ways considered the first president of the people, quote unquote. But Jackson's presidency was nothing really to brag about. There was a lot of problems with Jackson's presidency, and Jackson himself ran a great campaign making himself seem as though he was a man of the people. But Jackson was a plantation owner. He was a wealthy dude. He had a lot of money. He had a lot of property. And so he really isn't a man of the people. But there's times in history where we see that, where wealthy, politicians manage to convince themselves that they are people, that they are politicians of the people, when in reality they don't really have anything in common with your average wage laborer here in the United States. But people go and they vote for these people and think that they're going to help them out. This is very true of the case of Jackson. And so over time, democracy has widened to include everybody that is of legal age and a legal citizen of the United States. But there is still, I think, a fear amongst the elite classes of the United States that your everyday working class person may not be as informed as they could be about the electoral process in general, basic functioning of the government, and so on. And this is concerning, it should be concerning to us. We want people to value their education. One of the reasons that you are required in the state of California as a senior to take government and economics is because we want kids who are about to hit 18 years old to have an understanding and a proper education in how the government works. And I'm not saying that everybody that graduates from high school in the United States after taking high school government classes has that. But it's extremely important. And the more people that become aware of basic functioning of the government and how the government works and how the economy works and all of these kinds of things, the better decisions will be made by people in the polls. Pay for members of parliament. Why is pay for members of parliament something that the Chartists would support? That one might seem like it's antithetical to the Chartist movement. Why would Chartists want people who are already wealthy serving in parliament to also receive pay? Well, the answer actually comes down to this. If you give pay, here's the thing. In a time where you are not paid a salary for serving in government, even though it's basically a full-time job, that means that the only way that you would ever have been able to serve in parliament would be if you were already so wealthy that you could go and do a full-time job in parliament doing lawmaking for the nation of Great Britain and not have to get paid for it because you're so rich that you can just kind of go and live off of your existing wealth for nothing and serve in parliament. So the Chartists were saying, look, if you made it so that people who served in parliament were paid, that would open the door for people who are not as wealthy, who cannot walk away from their jobs or their businesses or their farms to go and serve in parliament. So that's why they want pay, is to open the door for less wealthy people to be able to go and serve in Parliament and not go broke in the process. And then annual elections. The reason that annual elections never came to fruition, and I want you to imagine what this would be like here in the United States. Imagine if every year we voted for president. Nothing would ever get done. Because the entire year, if everybody was annually elected, the entire year would be spent campaigning. At some point, you want the people who you vote for to start doing some work and make laws and get things done, handle business, handle the general affairs of government. So annual elections never goes through because it's just too short of a time. If you were doing a yearly election, people would just spend the entire year endlessly campaigning to try to hold on to their position in Parliament. So here you can see a clipping from a newspaper Chartist demonstration. Peace and order is our motto. Notice the deference to authority there. Peace and order. To the working men of London, fellow men. Notice women were disincluded. Fellow men, the press having misrepresented and vilified us and our intentions, the demonstration committee therefore consider it to be their duty to state that the grievances of us, the working classes, are deep and our demands just. We and our families are pining in misery, want, and starvation. We demand a fair day's wages for a fair day's work. We are the slaves of capital. We demand protection to our labor. We are political serfs. We demand to be free. We therefore invite all well-disposed to join in our peaceful procession on Monday next, April 10, as it is for the good of all that we seek to remove the evils under which we groan. So, that is the position of the Chartists in this demonstration. Parliament did not act on the people's petition. You had this massive petition that a lot of working class people signed. Demonstrations were organized at various points between 1838 and 1848. Some of these demonstrations were not so peaceful and resort to violence. Here you can see a rather funny picture because all these guys are like dressed in suits and top hats, and those are the police, and they're coming in with clubs to beat down the riotous workers who are dressed in more plain clothing. But some of these movements in London and across England from the Chartists break out in violence. So the Great Chartist Meeting of 1848 was the most significant one, and this is where the estimates of the people. This is a point of view sort of a thing that you could use in a DBQ. And if we had three different sources that we were looking at as to who joined in this Great Chartist Meeting of 1848, the Chartists themselves, the working class, estimated that about 300,000 people congregated for this Great Chartist meeting. The government, which was trying to put down the Chartist meeting, estimated that about 15,000 people showed up. And then the Sunday Observer, which was the newspaper that reported on the incident, estimated at about 50,000. If we're doing a point of view thing, we would say that the Chartists probably grossly overestimated the number of people because their estimate is 300,000. That's a lot higher than the other two estimates. So they were probably exaggerating the influence of their cause. The government, on the other hand, which was against the Chartist movement, estimated it to be 15,000 people, which is probably a little lower because the government has an interest, a point of view, in trying to diminish the influence of the Chartist movement. Meanwhile, the newspaper reporting on it, we can trust the newspaper a little bit better in this scenario. You can't always trust newspapers better, but in this scenario we can, because first of all, their estimate falls somewhere between the other two numbers, and the Sunday Observer was kind of a third party. It didn't have a stake in trying to manipulate the numbers. They're trying to report the truth and objectively. And so they probably had the most accurate number of these estimates of the Chartist movement. And this came very close to a full-blown revolution, but the Chartists were lined up on one side of the Thames, the police and military were lined up on the other, and they kind of lost their backbone at the last minute, and it dissolves without having much influence. But as I said, the Chartist movement isn't successful in getting their demands met right away, but over time, as the century continues to progress and the Chartist movement is a long forgotten memory, eventually the demands that they had initially been seeking are eventually passed. Let's move on to France. There was a fundamental desire for more representative rule underlying the revolution in France, and more immediately the expansion of the franchise in England, thanks to the Reform Bill of 1832, put pressure on France. And under the July Monarchy, established in the revolutions of 1838, all these political demonstrations were outlawed. So people instead started organizing political banquets that were outlawed just before the revolutions of 1848 in France as well. And these political banquets were places where, notable, mostly men, would show up and have these discussions, kind of, similar to the salons. They kind of had to take place underground. You can't just outlaw people having banquets, but of course the banquets were intended to be politically oriented, and they were held in private rather than in public. Meanwhile, the French government down the line does ultimately outlaw them. But here are some people of the French Provisional Government of 1848. Remember that in the Revolution of 1848, the bourgeois king Louis Philippe was removed from power, and we saw this group of French gentlemen take over the government for a short time. Of all of these people, the guy in the upper left-hand corner is a guy named Louis Blanc. He will come into our story in just a little bit here. Louis Philippe, the July monarch, bourgeois king, was deposed, taken out of power, and the Second Republic of France was created with a guy by the name of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who ends up becoming Napoleon III, winning the French election of 1848. Now, ironically, even though he became the president of the Second Republic of France, just 4 years later, he staged a coup, dissolved the Second Republic, and reinstated the French Empire, similar to Napoleon Bonaparte's French Empire going back to the beginning of the 19th century. And he creates the Second French Empire with himself as emperor, ruling until he was defeated in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, which was a war between France and Prussia. And so that is how Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, otherwise known as Napoleon III, sees the end of his political career when he is captured in the Franco-Prussian War. The February Revolution is what it's sometimes called. Working class and liberals were very unhappy with King Louis Philippe, the bourgeois king, especially though his minister Francois Guizot, who opposed electoral reforms. And so Louis Philippe was forced to abdicate the throne in February of 1848, and that's when this provisional temporary government with Lamartine and Louis Blanc and these guys come into power for a short time and establish the Second French Republic. And so here's a political cartoon. The artist Charles Philipson was jailed for this 1831 unkind portrayal of the king. The pear was a euphemism for an ineffective working male body part, but they made his head into the shape of a pear. And Antoine Damier, a artist from the realist art style, defiantly supported Philipson by publishing a caricature of his original controversial cartoon, once again in the shape of a head of a pear. And so this was, of course, extremely offensive and unkind. But the group of bourgeois liberals who form this provisional government are led by a guy named Alphonse Lamartine, and they are allied with the bourgeoisie, the liberals, wealthy upper middle class. Louis Blanc, the reason he's significant is because he was actually a socialist thinker who led the working classes and demanded work for the unemployed, and this ends up getting him into hot water with the other members of the French provisional government of 1848, and he ultimately gets fired. And that actually is a bad thing because Louis Blanc was considered an ally of the working classes who, when he gets fired, the working classes are very resentful of that. National workshops were created to provide work for the unemployed. Think of these as almost like poorhouses. They're not a place where you really want to find yourself. A national workshop would have been grueling labor for very little wages, but it would have at least given you a job and maybe gotten you enough money to support your basic needs. The kinds of reforms that the Second French Republic make are that they abolished slavery in the empire. This had already been outlawed by the British going back to about 1807. They created a 10-hour workday in Paris, and they abolished the death penalty as well. And here you can see, it's kind of a distorted image, but this is an image of the Revolution of 1848 in France, and the provisional government created this new Second French Republic whereby elections would take place, and by April, so the Revolution of 1848 in France happened in February. Remember that the one in 1830 happened in July. Okay, so the Revolution of 1848 is February, the Revolution of 1830 is July. But in the Revolution of 1848, by April, okay, two and a half months after the February Revolution, April elections for a new constituent assembly saw some conflict emerging between liberal capitalists and socialists because workers were seeking a revolutionary republic after Blanc gets fired from the assembly. Remember, I said he was an ally of the working class, and so workers get very upset when he is removed from the assembly. By June, another couple of months later, there's what they call the June Days Revolution of 1848. The cause of the June Days Revolution was that the government closed down those national workshops that had put a lot of unemployed French people to work. This marked the beginning of class warfare between the bourgeoisie and the working class, the proletariat, in France, which, by the way, is a rather prescient thing because this is precisely the kind of thing that Karl Marx was writing about in Germany pertaining to the Communist Manifesto. He was predicting in the Communist Manifesto that class warfare was inevitable and that it was beyond a shadow of a doubt that the proletariat would rise up and wage war against the bourgeoisie for unfair political practices and the oppression of the working class. Workers were seeking a war against poverty, a redistribution of income, and so, as is common during revolutions in France, they throw up the barricades. That's always one of the things that they do in French Revolution, throw the barricades up. And they put barricades up in the street to oppose government forces. And here you can see a painting of the Battle of Soufflot, where barricades at Rue Soufflot Street were thrown up on June 24th, 1848. Chaos is breaking out in France, and there is basically a war happening in Paris between the working class and the liberal government. Who ends up winning is the conservatives. General Cavaignac is the leader of the French military forces in Paris who are trying to subdue the June Days revolt, and he crushes the revolt, killing 10,000 Parisian workers. This would be a temporary victory for conservatives, and General Cavaignac assumes dictatorial powers at this time and ends up running for president. However, the election of 1848 sees Cavaignac defeated by Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, and Louis Napoleon becomes the leader of the Republic, the new president of France. But by 1852, after just one term serving as president, and by the way, that was the thing about the Second French Republic, is that whoever was elected was only allowed a single 4-year term. And so as his 4-year term is about to be up, Louis Napoleon consolidates his power, stages a coup, and successfully overthrows the Second French Republic and turns himself into Emperor Napoleon III of the Second French Empire. And so the new leader of France for the foreseeable future is going to be Napoleon III, and he will be leader of France from 1848, when he was initially just President Louis Napoleon, until 1852, when he becomes Emperor Napoleon III, and that lasts all the way up until 1871. So he's in power for about 23, 24 years. Jumping over to Germany. In 1848, Germany was still not unified. Germany was a loosely organized collection of 39 Germanic states. And there were a number of sporadic uprisings that happened in several of these states that pushed for German unity and liberal reforms in Germany. However, the aristocracy, the noble class, the Junkers and various other cunning conservative politicians were able to put the revolutions of 1848 down in these various German states. And the reign of the king of Prussia, as well as various other leaders of the states, continued. And much of the failure of the revolutions in Germany happens due to something known as the Frankfurt Assembly. The Frankfurt Assembly was a meeting of notables who came together to try to come up with a constitutional format for the unification of Germany. But the members of the Frankfurt Assembly had a lot of disagreements on a common vision for a post-revolution Germany, a post-unified state. And this was largely due to the diversity of the German states themselves, as well as the differing class goals of the various members that met in the Frankfurt Assembly. famously, when the Frankfurt Assembly gets done creating this kind of vision of a unified Germany, they present the petition to the Kaiser, and he basically says, "I will not accept a crown from the gutter." That was his response. "I will not accept a crown from the gutter." And that puts the nail in the coffin in the Frankfurt Assembly's attempts to institute this unified, overly idealized liberal vision of a future constitutionally unified Germany. Jumping over to the Habsburgs in Austria. Okay, the Habsburgs in Austria. Given the diverse range of ethnicities within the Austrian Empire, the revolutions of 1838 were particularly devastating to Austria because it demonstrated to Austria that in a time where nationalism is really used by liberals to try to bring nations together, because of the multinational ethnic composition of the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian Empire, they are really going to struggle from fragmentation due to each of the various groups pushing for recognition, representation in Austria. And so, driven by nationalism, the entire Habsburg Empire rose up in revolution. However, it was able to forcibly put down all of the revolutions of 1848, including the one of Hungary. And the reason that the Hungarian one is significant is because the Hungarians were the largest ethnic minority of the Austrian Empire. They, for a long time, the Hungarians were this ethnic minority that made up a very sizable amount of the population of the Empire of Austria. And you can see here what I mean. The Hungarians almost nearly equal that in number in terms of German Austrians. And of course, you had other revolutions breaking out in Bohemia, Prague, by the Czechs. Okay, the Czechs, the Slavic Congress of 1848 was one location of these revolutions. The Krakow uprising up here by Ukrainians. Okay, the Hungarian revolutions that took place in 1848 and 49 by Hungarians. And then, of course, you had revolutions right in the heart of the Austrian Empire in the capital of Vienna as well. And fortunately, the Austrians were able to, or fortunately, at least for the conservatives in Austria, they were able to put these down. However, they would boil up again in future years. So Hungary, looking at the Hungarian revolutions of 1848, Hungary was able to achieve independence from the Austrian Habsburg through negotiations that were enabled by the general state of revolt throughout Austria. However, when Russia comes in to help the Austrian Habsburgs out, Austria was able to defeat Hungary in a war of independence that characterized the general failures of the 1848 revolutions at large. And so initially, at first, it was looking like, thanks to the state of chaos that Austria was facing, that they would be able to that Hungary would be able to overcome the widespread failures of the various other revolutions happening across Europe at this time. But because Russia comes in and helps Austria out, they were able to put down the Hungarian War of Independence. However, Hungary would be able to gain a degree of independence following the defeat of Austria in the Austro-Prussian War. Famously, just how many years is that? 18 years after the revolutions of 1848, the Hungarians had not forgotten about their war of independence being crushed by the Habsburgs and the Russians. And in 1866, Prussia, in a very interesting move, and we'll talk more about this when we get to it, we're not quite there yet, but just to give you a preview of what's to come, Prussia goes to war with Austria, which was interesting because they're both German, right? And what this did was it permanently asserted Prussia's dominance over Austria in terms of military prowess. And remember that by the time that we get to 1848, Austria is kind of a falling star. It's a star that's at the end of its life. Germany, on the other hand, is a star that is burning bright and hot. And it is growing in magnitude and in power. And so this war between Prussia and Austria opened the door back up for the Hungarians within the Austrian Empire to push for equal representation. And what this did was it resulted in something known as the Compromise of 1867, which established what was known as a dual monarchy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So if you've ever heard of or learned about World War I before and heard about Austria-Hungary as a place, Austria-Hungary, it was because by that point, after 1867, it was viewed as a co-monarchy where you had internal autonomy for the Hungarians, who essentially ruled themselves alongside the Habsburgs, who ruled the rest of Greater Austria. And so this was a dual monarchy. They don't completely separate from one another. Hungary remains part of the Austrian Empire, but it has equal status in rule to the Austrians for their regions, the Hungarian regions. All right, so that kind of gives you an understanding of how Hungary emerges as a as its own state down the line. In Italy, we also see revolutions. These revolutions were caused by the emergence of nationalism throughout Europe and sentiment about the greatness of Rome and Italy's past. Although the revolution succeeded in deposing Bourbon rule from the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, it ends up being defeated 16 months later with the reinstatement of Bourbon rule. And so, like with many of the revolutions of 1848, once again, the Italian states faced defeat. The constitutional system that was created during that time was relatively advanced. However, Italy did not unite during this time, as the focus was around creating a confederation of Italian states that would retain their autonomy, similar to the way that the German Confederacy worked, where each of the 39 states of Germany, before they unify in 1871, had themselves. And so Italy was trying to kind of create a similar confederacy, if you will, of Italian states, which would remain autonomous, in part because, similar to Germany, these Italian states, going back hundreds of years in history, they didn't really all view themselves as the same. These states had different histories. At different times, they would be warring with one another. Some of the states were more urbanized, others of them were more rural, some of them in Germany, some of them were more Protestant, others were more Catholic. There wasn't really a singular history that they drew upon. And that's what made it difficult for Italy and Germany to unify. But conservatives in the era after the revolutions of 1848 would use nationalism as a tool to get people to kind of forget about, or at least minimally smooth over, some of these historical grievances that they had, and begin to identify as a single national entity. So, but Italy, similar to Germany, Italy will not unify until about a decade or 2 decades after the failures of the revolutions of 1848. What about Poland? Poland's not even a country at this point. But there are still a lot of Polish people living in the areas where the Kingdom of Poland used to exist prior to the partitions of Poland, when Austria, Prussia, and Russia divided the lands up of Poland and basically completely dissolved it and got rid of the Polish kingdom. But Polish people haven't forgotten about their history and their heritage, and in an effort to weaken Russia, Prussia and armed Polish prisoners in an effort to weaken Russia and Prussia, this is kind of worded badly, in an effort to weaken Prussia and Russia, armed Polish prisoners encouraged them to begin a revolution in Poland. And they did, and at first focused their efforts on independence from Russia. However, public sentiment eventually turned as Prussia had annexed Polish land in the partition of Poland. So the Poles confronted Prussians in armed conflict, but of course that was going to be an ill-fated conflict because the Prussian military by this point was far, far, far more advanced than the Polish military was, and this forced the Poles into focusing on economic growth because they realized that they weren't going to be able to obtain their independence through diplomacy since their military was just too weak and they were not organized enough to be able to create a state again. So, evaluating these revolutions of 1848, neither liberal or nationalist revolutionaries nor those of conservatism were able to maintain their dominance between 1789 and 1848. Liberalism, nationalism, socialism, and democracy each made some gains, but were largely kept in check by conservatives, and these revolutions were, for the most part, put down by conservatives in power. Many of the revolutions were spontaneous movements that really couldn't effectively maintain popular support. Again, going back to the idea of the spirit of romanticism that had engendered much of these revolutions, because of the pie in the sky, overly idealized, spontaneous nature of these romantic liberal revolutions, national revolutions that started in various places across Europe in 1848, they just were not able to effectively organize and maintain a unified common trajectory. And so these divisions and the lack of organization, the lack of what we might call pragmatic or practical politics, is precisely in some sense what leads to their epic failures. And the revolutions, we also have to remember, were largely urban in nature. Okay, conservative landowners and peasants essentially thwarted the revolutions because they didn't want to see all of these changes take place. Remember, I've told you several times now, peasants tend to be pretty conservative. Peasants who were still living in rural areas, particularly in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, were not as inspired by the urban liberal bourgeois-led revolts of the cities. And so the middle classes who were leading these revolutions really came to start fearing the radicalism of their working class allies. And that's the other side of this, is that, you know, as industrialization is continuing to proliferate in these urban areas that are starting to pop up across urban cities across the continent, you know, they needed the support of the working class. But we have to understand that there are going to be some natural differences in their agendas, because the working class lives in wage labor misery, and the liberal bourgeois classes leading the revolts want to institute changes that will precisely work in opposition to the goals of the urban workers. And so these divisions too make it difficult for the 1848 revolutions to get off the ground. The divisions amongst the national ethnic groups, in particular in Austria, also helped destroy these revolutionary movements, because when people started to revolt in the name of nationalism in places like Austria, where you had multinational ethnic backgrounds, each of them has their own agendas, Each of them has their own goals for independence, and this too leads to a fragmenting in the solidarity of the cause. So, positive aspects of the revolutions of 1848. Well, of course, you had universal male suffrage that was introduced in France. The French revolutions of 1848 are one of the few that actually result in a successful transition of power, even though it does ultimately lead to despotic rule by Napoleon III. Serfdom remained abolished in Austria and the German states. Parliaments are established in Prussia and other German states. Even though they were still dominated by princes and aristocrats, at least you start to see a quasi-representative government beginning to form in some of the German states. And then Prussia and Sardinia-Piedmont are going to emerge as the largest kingdoms of Prussia, of Germany and Italy, respectively, rather. So Prussia being the largest, most powerful kingdom of the German Confederacy, Sardinia-Piedmont becoming the most powerful kingdom of Italy during this time. And they emerge with new energy to achieve unification within the next 2 decades. So we are moving towards German and Italian unification coming up, towards the latter part of this unit here. But the revolutions of 1848 and 49 brought to a close the era of liberal revolutions that had started in France going back to 1789 when we learned about the French Revolution, the first one. Reformers and revolutionaries learned that planning and organization was absolutely necessary for success. It couldn't just be spontaneous revolutions inspired by nationalism, inspired by liberalism, they began to understand that rational arguments in revolution would not always assure their success. And so the age of Romanticism that we see characterize the first half of the 19th century, very quickly after the end of the failed revolutions of 1848, transitions and gives way to an age of realism, which is portrayed both through art and literature and political philosophy, but also manifests on a national political stage, because we see the age of real politic emerge after the failures of the liberal revolutions inspiring the revolutions of 1848. And so this age of Romanticism ends, and we see the beginning of a new age of both artistic and political realism, meaning that the goals of future politicians, mostly a new brand of conservative politicians, would begin instituting very laser precise, well thought out reforms that were pragmatic and successful in beginning to change the landscape of European politics in the second half of the 19th century. Much more pragmatic, practical goal setting that they are using in the age of real politic, rather than the overly idealized romantic visions of revolution that people had in the first half of the 19th century. And folks, that brings me, this is just a quick political cartoon here. You can see it says John Bull and his friends. This is a political cartoon from 1900, but you can see how you are beginning to see the beginnings of national representation here in this artistic image, where you have various Slavic peoples down here in the Balkans, the southeast area of Europe. Over here you have the remnants of the sick man of Europe, otherwise known as the Ottoman Empire. Here you have Russia depicted as a giant kraken, led by the Tsar, who by this point is a guy by the name of Nicholas II. And then you have over here representations of France via the Phrygian bonnet and kind of the classic garb of the sans-culotte French revolutionaries. You have over here the Prussians, the British, the Irish, the Spanish, the Italians down here, represented by different national groups. And this is kind of the direction that we are going in history now, is that after the revolutions of 1848, increasingly we are going to see nationalism as the metric of defining where the boundaries of states exist, dividing them up by the kinds of people who live within those states. So that brings me to the end of my lecture today, folks. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm in just another 2 minutes here after I finish up this lecture. I'm going to post a new reading guide assignment, which will be due for Friday. So please do get that done and hand it in on Canvas. And that's it from me. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you back on Friday morning for German and Italian unification. Have a great day.